to Healing Synergies podcast, the podcast we discuss about sensory processing and other pediatric conditions and treatment approaches. I am the founder and occupational therapist at Healing Synergy, a pediatric occupational therapy practice that is based in North Carolina. Here we provide customized occupational therapy and feeding therapy in the natural setting, that is in the homes, so daycares, schools. And what we do is we equip families and caregivers with the tools and home programs that is individualized to meet the child's needs. And today I'm really excited that we have Dr. Esmeralda Vazquez, who is a pediatric occupational therapist from Chicago, Illinois, who works very closely with the Spanish-speaking population back in Chicago. And I'm really thrilled to have her. She was also a close friend back in Chicago. Dr. Vazquez, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey into OT, and the population you serve?
Right. So I have been an occupational therapist going on 19 years now, next year, so a really long time. I started in early intervention, and I have just stayed in early intervention. I love working in the communities. I always tell people that's where the magic happens, in their home environments, in their living rooms, in their playgrounds. So I love going to the communities. Also, I work part-time at a clinic at Shirley AbilityLab in their wheelchair and seating department. And it's really nice because sometimes I get to see some of my early intervention kiddos transition out of early intervention, and then I continue seeing them in the wheelchair and seating center. So I get to see them grow and stay in touch with the families. And in the wheelchair clinic, it's very highly complex seating. We do manual wheelchairs, power wheelchairs, advanced electronics, so all sorts of very complex seating and positioning equipment. And then, just to make a little bit of extra money, I do some PRN work at Lurie's Children's Hospital in the NICU.
Oh, nice. You also moved into the NICU too.
I do. Yeah, but I love the little babies too. And it's really nice because I've had the privilege of working with the families in the NICU and then transition to early intervention. And then I transition them to the wheelchair and seating center. So I follow the families for many, many years.
Wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that you actually started off. I mean, you are seeing them in the NICU itself. That's amazing. I wanted to just backtrack just a little bit. So with the children that you treat, what's the population like? What's the predominant issues that they have?
Right. So I'm a native Spanish speaker, and there's such a huge service gap in the Latino community, in the Spanish speaking families. So I specifically go to the Spanish speaking neighborhoods. And because I have a lot of that very complex medical training background, like in the hospital setting and inpatient settings, I tend to see a lot of the more medically complex kiddos with genetic disorders, tracheostomies, cerebral palsy. I do obviously also see like autism, individuals with Down syndrome. It's as needed, and I mean, wherever I'm called to serve, that's where I typically go. But I think the service coordinators kind of know my specialty, so if they have a very medically complex kiddo, they give me a call and ask me if I can pick up the case.
That's awesome. And so do you just see those kids in Chicago itself, or also in the surrounding areas?
It's Chicago, specifically the south side of Chicago. So I serve anybody who's familiar with Chicago. I serve Pilsen, back of the yards, and a little bit of the Inglewood neighborhoods.
Okay.
So very, very underserved neighborhoods, lower income, a lot of immigrant families. So there's a lot of need, and there's just not that many Spanish speaking families. And there are providers, and they use interpreters, but I think a lot sometimes gets lost in translation. So preferably they try to match a Spanish speaking family with a Spanish speaking provider if available.
Right. And that's what I was thinking. I don't think there's enough for therapists who are like bilingual, who can actually, and I'm thinking from back in the day in Chicago when I was working that, like you said, it gets lost in translation. All that's great, but sometimes you can hear that's not exactly what I said.
Right. And I'm on the other end because at Shirley Ryan, AbilityLab, I work also with a lot of Middle Eastern families who come from abroad to get service in our hospital. So I use Arabic interpreters, and I'll say something and I'm like, but I feel like there was a lot said in there. Like, what did the mom actually say? So yeah, so things get and I mean, and there's just all these like little cultural things that sometimes cannot be translated. So that's why I typically work mostly with the Spanish speaking families. And it's actually like a goal that I made to myself. Like when I graduated, I told myself I want to go back and serve this particular community because I know the language and the culture.
No, that's amazing what you've done. I mean, you've taken that and the fact that you're actually providing it in the area, that much needed area for that community. And you talk about the different complex medical cases that you're dealing with, especially with the socioeconomic group where these families come from. How are they managing it?
It's very stressful because they have multiple providers, medical providers, physicians, and sometimes they don't know what specialty they're seeing. So it's a lot of let me see the paperwork that you got. Let's review the paperwork. A lot of the times they're thinking they're seeing a neurologist when it's actually a physiatrist, or a developmental pediatrician. So I kind of help them kind of navigate those barriers, and it's very common and not just like, I mean, even like well-educated individuals, like our healthcare system is just, it's very complex, navigating insurance and policies and how to make appointments and the frustration of having to wait sometimes to see a specialist. So, I mean, I support them in all of that aspect, like how to navigate the healthcare system, like where are the barriers and how can we can like reduce those barriers to improve access and overall like their healthcare outcomes.
No, that's awesome because I could, like you said, especially when they're coming out of the NICU, they've got so many providers who are giving them different information.
Right. They come out with multiple appointments, several times a week. And initially coming out of the NICU, they are set up with very like every month or every 2 months. So they have to kind of navigate like what doctor am I seeing? How am I going to get there? Who's going to pick up my other kids from school? Like just navigating life around all these medical appointments and providing support because it's just very stressful, like getting a diagnosis or having to deal with like medical equipment, a ventilator, a tracheostomy, a G-tube. So kind of just supporting them in all aspects. I mean, we also have social work and we definitely love our social workers and we refer often. We provide so many services just to kind of help families like kind of just navigate this very rough transition in their lives.
Has how do they how you talked about the stress. How are they managing through this very complex issue, and how are the moms managing it, or caregivers managing the stress level?
So one of the things that I have learned is that for families who have these very complex medical diagnoses, like maybe like cerebral palsy or a rare genetic disorder, or children with like respiratory and they're on ventilators, they're very isolated. There's not a lot of support groups where we can refer. For example, there's a huge support group for autism, especially for Spanish speaking families in the Chicagoland area.
That's
So they
awesome.
have that nice little support group. So when they initially get that diagnosis, they have this like community of other mothers who come in and welcome them in and help them kind of navigate their life experience. I feel like for the other families who don't have Down syndrome or autism, they're very isolated and they don't know who to connect with. So if I have other families in mind, I have kind of connected them because what I tell the families, their lived experience, it can't be taught. Like I don't know what it's like to be a mother of a child with complex medical needs. I'm trying to be the best provider, healthcare provider I can be, but I don't know what it's like to having to like push a wheelchair down the street or having to wait for the public transportation in a wheelchair or all these other stressors. So I try to connect if I know two moms together that I feel will be a good match. And it has worked in the past, but I feel like there's definitely a need for some sort of a support group where they can be provided with education and just any other sort of like community like bonding that they need.
You addressed a couple of really important issues. I think it's so natural to you. The fact that there isn't resources, someone that they can pick up. I know, when they first get a diagnosis, it's usually they're just going through the emotions as well. Like, what do I do? And suddenly they feel really isolated, like you said, because that's the family. Some of the families I've dealt with have expressed that, like, what do we do? Where can we go? And then if you have also a language barrier added to that, that is just huge. Yeah.
Right. And they're always looking for answers. Like when they get a diagnosis, any diagnosis, like if they get cerebral palsy, are they going to walk? Are they going to talk? And it's very difficult questions for me to answer. And I always kind of tend to defer back to the physician, but they don't get the answers they're looking for. And the best I can do is like, well, cerebral palsy can be very variable. We have to kind of see as the child grows, how they're going to develop. The same thing for like autism. Are they going to talk? Are they going to live independently? They have all these questions that they're seeking and some sort of comfort, or they go online and they try to do their own research. And fortunately, I'm starting to see a lot more resources in Spanish, websites in the US, and I think also like in South America, they can access that information, but there's definitely a need for more information in Spanish and in other languages too.
Right. You again, it's just something to think about, like the different diagnosis needs. We can take it as an example with the autism population, what they've done, and to bring people in for the other diagnosis as well. Maybe that's a place that they could go to and have a camaraderie, because a lot of times when mothers talk to each other, suddenly they realize this is not the only problem I've got. This is something else that you're facing. How did you manage that? And it's just like talking to a friend. Or they also share a lot of resources. So yeah, that's great.
Right.
With the I know you deal with like the CP population as well. And you talked about the environment, right? So if they are going out, pushing a wheelchair down the street or trying to get into public transportation, how easy is that? Or what are the challenges? Have they talked to you about that before?
So I don't think we realize, like when we are just able to walk easily and go up and down the stairs, how easy things are for us. And I try to look at things through the lens of somebody who's kind of navigating our environment in a wheelchair. And I can definitely like identify, even in my own community, like a wheelchair's not going to fit through that little sidewalk, or there's that huge little like uneven surface. Somebody's going to like topple over there. So one of the biggest things is transportation. I mean, we have good public transportation, but oftentimes in the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority, either the elevators are broken, or the lift in the bus is not working. So families are left there like trying to figure out a solution, like waiting for the second bus, walking to the next train stop. If the wheelchair, like if they have a medical stroller, that's a complicated one. It doesn't look medical enough for like a wheelchair. The buses sometimes will not lower the platform for them. So it's also having this understanding that when they are carrying equipment, a ventilator, an oxygen tank, a wheelchair, sometimes they arrive late to their appointments because they have just so much to like navigate, and who's going to help them with that? Do they have a nurse at home or a family member? Is transportation going to pick them up on time? If they use Illinois, we have like transportation service, but oftentimes they don't arrive on time. So the family sometimes can plan accordingly, like they'll tell them that their appointment is 2 hours early, knowing that they're going to arrive late so they can arrive to their medical appointment on time. So those are like social determinants of health to keep in mind, that individuals have to navigate a lot more to get to a medical appointment. Wheelchairs are heavy.
Right.
They're very heavy to lift. They're very heavy to break down and transport, depending on the type of wheelchair. Does a family have stairs? How are they going to bump it up and down? Do they have a wheelchair lift? So all these things, all the environmentally that I have to kind of discuss with the families, and it can be very overwhelming in the first appointment because a lot of these things they don't think about. And so I start asking questions like, how many stairs do you have? Well, it's going to be really difficult to bump up that wheelchair up and down the stairs. To let's figure out a solution.
You just addressed a lot of real life issues, because here you provide an equipment, but that doesn't mean the equipment's the equipment's good, but how is it gonna complement with other things that they have, right? Like you said, if they don't have transportation, they are dependent on public transportation, yet, like you talked about the strollers, and I'm just thinking, you're right. They don't look like they're medical, and the moms are not the only person. They usually have younger ones or other kids with them, and they have to finagle, try to
Yes,
manage.
right. Like if they're pregnant and we're doing an assessment and they're like, how am I going to push a stroller in the wheelchair? Or I just bought a car and it's a 4-door sedan. Is it going to fit in the trunk space? Or when they have like two car seats in the back row, like where am I going to put the wheelchair?
Right.
And all these other layers of barriers that we kind of have to kind of discuss. And sometimes we find solutions. And sometimes families have to sometimes make some really drastic changes in their life, like buying a new vehicle or having to move into a new home if that's an option for them. And it's not an option for everybody.
That's what I was thinking.
Right. Sometimes families just finish signing up a lease for an apartment and it's a second story. And now they have to wait a whole year before they can look for another apartment. And then rent is expensive, right? So there's all these other things that they have to consider aside from the needs of the medical needs of their child. Getting affordable housing that's wheelchair accessible, getting an accessible vehicle, so many things.
So with the accessible vehicles, is there any assistance, or is there any way they can find some kind of funding for that to make possible?
So, I mean, Illinois does have some funding. So Illinois has a department, DSCC, the Department of Children and Specialized Services. It's income based and also based on your diagnosis, but they provide some support. They will pay for a wheelchair lift or a ramp. So they'll modify your home if you're the homeowner. They have what they call a Scalmobile, so you can attach the wheelchair to that device and then it bumps it up for you up the stairs. They will pay for a ramp in a van, depending the model and the year of the van. So there's some services that the families can access.
Is that a long wait list, or do you get it automatically if you meet the criteria?
There's, I mean, a few months. They can get it within a few months if they meet all the criteria, like their diagnosis and their income. They'll send somebody and assess the home, and obviously they'll pay what the cheapest option is. It cheaper to build a ramp or install a wheelchair lift, or we give you the Scalmobile. So whatever the department feels is the most cost-effective option, that's what they're going to provide for the family. But it's a little something for some families that it could be a huge difference. Especially like if the child goes to school and every day you have to bump up the chair in and out in snowing conditions, in the rain. And then the child is going to grow. I mean, so some of those like 15-year-old boys are, almost like 6 feet tall, right? Yeah. I mean, they can be tall children sometimes. So, and then primarily depending on who's at home, if the mom is at home while the father works and the mother is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, sometimes on their own. I've seen some very powerful moms like lift up their children and like transfer them to the wheelchair, and they just had to learn how to do that.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about this, I just saw a child yesterday who has CP, and the mom was picking him up, and I was looking at her and I'm like, be careful with your back now, because they forget they've got other kids around and they're trying to like just manage. And I'm like, yeah, but you got to take care of your back as well, like just even the caregivers' health, because
Oh, yes. I mean, thank you for bringing that up. That is something that I do in my early intervention sessions, even though the children are very small. Body mechanics with transferring, how to pick up the child and protect your back, how to pick them up out of a bathtub, how to do the rotations without injuring your back.
right.
I feel like a lot of these families sometimes don't get that training. So I do it in the wheelchair clinic, sometimes many, many years later. But as an EI therapist, we are very well trained to educate the families on transfers so they can protect their bodies. We don't want them injured as their primary caregiver. So that's an excellent point. I'm so glad you do that. I always tell students, don't forget to always like educate families on like biomechanics when they're transferring their loved ones.
Yeah, because they don't think about it. And like you said, the kids are growing. So it has to become almost motor memory for the caregiver, because if you have proper mechanics, then you can continue to care because you don't want to have a bad back. And they're dependent on those needs. You talked about the weather in Chicago. I was just thinking about that because of the snow. That just adds another element of challenge, I guess.
And it's so when we think about weather, I mean, when we recommend a wheelchair, I always consider like, okay, who's going to be pushing it, who's going to be lifting it, who's going to be the main one managing the wheelchair. Is it the individual? Is it going to be a caregiver? And we consider the environment. I mean, we have people who live in the city and we have individuals who live in very rural communities, right? So we have to consider like what kind of tire are they going to get, right? um, um, how much resistance and friction that tire provides. And then in winter, um, ice, snow, right? Nothing works on ice. I tell the families it's gonna slide in a ramp if it's not salted, and if there's ice, a layer of ice, there's no tire that's gonna fix that. It's gonna slide out. Um, and then it's such a barrier, like in the city, not everybody shovels their sidewalks. And I'm always so considerate of that. I mean, as soon as the snow starts falling, I'm out there shoveling because I know that individuals are, in wheelchairs and also like mothers and strollers. Let's just make everything like universally accessible.
Right.
But I mean, that's one of the things that a lot of individuals say, like, I mean, how do I manage snow? Is there a good tire for snow? Or can I switch to like summer tires and winter tires, just like in vehicles? And I always ask them, like, okay, do you have a pavement? Is it grass? Is it gravel? What's your environment like in your community or your sidewalk or your driveway? And we have so many different like environments. So I always kind of have to consider all of those things.
Right. And then you also mentioned about some families will, they're renting places. So that means they may change homes or move homes, right? So then the environment becomes different for them. Um, how long before, you can request for a new wheelchair?
So, all right, this is kind of the general rule is that the insurance companies want at least 5 years out of a wheelchair. At 5 years, they will consider a new one. But there are some exceptions, right? So pediatric chairs grow. They're designed to grow and they can grow many, many years. But I mean, some children like go through these like really big growth spurts, and I don't know how tall they're gonna get. I try to look at the parents to see how tall they are, but that's sometimes a good indicator, and oftentimes it's not. So for pediatrics, we order the chair and it grows. And if that wheelchair has reached the maximum growth, then we can justify to the insurance, okay, they maxed out their growth potential and they are currently this height and this weight, it's time for a new wheelchair. And with that justification, we can make a case for a new wheelchair. The tricky part is like our little tiny ones, our little like 1-year-old and 2-year-olds, because oftentimes families still kind of want a stroller because it's maybe a little bit easier to navigate and fold, and it folds like a regular commercial stroller so they can put it in their trunk. But they don't have a lot of growth. So sometimes we have to figure out like, okay, do we recommend a stroller or can we move into like a wheelchair? And it's a very difficult transition for families. Like I had to meet them where they're at and when they're ready. Do they want a wheelchair?
Right.
Because sometimes it looks very medical, and they prefer a stroller because it just looks a little bit more like a commercial stroller. So they're very difficult conversations to have with the families. And it also is, where are they in their journey of accepting the diagnosis? So that's when, like, as an occupational therapist, like all our background in psychology comes in, like using like our therapeutic use of self and understanding the families. But these are very difficult conversations to have when we're talking about wheelchair because they think, are you telling me he's never going to walk?
Mhm.
And like we don't say yes or no. We just say like, well, right now I think they need a wheelchair. Will make things a little bit easier for now. You'll continue with your ambulatory goals with your physical therapist. So that it's a very, you have to use a very special kind of a very empathetic conversation with the families, and sometimes tears are shed, and they need some emotional support when we're talking about wheelchair, especially if it's their first one.
Right. Because I can only imagine when they first get the diagnosis and you're talking to them. They've got all this like millions of questions, and walking seems to be one of the big ones. They will always ask you that. Um, so yeah, those are challenging questions. And I guess because they have you and you're like a consistent provider, you build like this professional but friendly relationship that they can rely on you to get, either directions or the support, I guess. The support. Yeah.
Right. So it that's the beauty of working in different settings, that when I work in early intervention, we build this really nice relationship with the families, and we see the children for 2, 3 years sometimes. Once a week, we the same routine, right? And then if they need a wheelchair, it's easier for me to have that conversation with them, and they trust me as their provider. So we have that very difficult conversation. But also on the other end, when I'm in the clinic and they're not families that I work with, I can almost have a vision and understand of maybe what they feel like based on like the families that I work with. So I try to pick up a lot of their like nonverbal cues, like has anybody spoken to them about a wheelchair? Has a physician spoken to them? And then start from there, like offering options. And some families are very accepting, like, yes, I need a wheelchair. He wants to move, he's ready. And some of them are not. And it's all very case by case and very individualized to the family, like their process and how they're going through it.
Um, are there are there rental apartments? So the one thing I know is with wheelchairs, you need to have the space, like between, the door space to get in, the width as well. So if they are renting an apartment, um, especially the older kind of designed homes, they may not meet those requirements. So am I wrong with that?
You're correct. Like, I mean, in the city of Chicago, a lot of the apartments, um, they're very small. The bathrooms, I don't know. We always talk about this in the clinic. The bathroom, the only room that everybody in the house needs to access, has the narrowest door. We don't understand why in the very old buildings, very old apartments, very narrow. Um, so the city of Chicago, I mean, we have been very vocal. I know that the disability community has been very, very vocal about accessible housing and affordable housing. So they're, whenever they're building new housing, they are making it wider doors, room for like a larger turning radius. But when it's not and they're renting, I mean, they are covered in Chicago, renters, by certain laws. Like they can make some reasonable modifications. Like they can widen up the door. Like that doesn't really kind of change the aesthetics, right? Making the bathroom fully wheelchair accessible, that can be like a little iffy because some landlords do not want a rolling shower. They like the bathtub. So that's a conversation to have with the landlord. Um, they can install a ramp, but I think they have to kind of maybe remove it afterwards. So there are some reasonable modifications that renters can do to their apartments. And sometimes families get lawyers involved because they can't find any other housing. It's very difficult to find housing, wheelchair accessible in the city, and sometimes even like surrounding neighborhoods or suburbs.
And that's what I was thinking about, because homes are not like built based on ADA compliance,
Right.
especially the older homes, like you said. I think people were a lot smaller before because everything is like tiny.
The doors are really narrow. There's not a lot of space to turn around. Um, and some of the wheelchairs, I mean, initially for a little 2, 3 year old, they're really small, maybe like 18 inches, they're very tiny. But that little child is going to grow and that chair is going to get wider and longer. So the turning radius in the bathroom has to be kind of considered. So we talk about all those things, and some families eventually maybe move to like an accessible house, and I have these conversations so they can start planning their next few years, like, okay, your next vehicle, I mean, I know you can put this in the trunk, but maybe in your next vehicle consider maybe a van. It's going to be easier for you to load the wheelchair in there, and think about maybe housing.
Right. Do they have like in the housing department, like how do they know where to go? Which homes are accessible? Do they have like a listing or a place they can go to look up the listing for possible homes?
I asked that question to a lot of my family. Some realtors may have a list when
Okay.
something comes up in the market or available for rent. I think there's like a criteria that they kind of fill out. Like these are like, it has a attached garage, a detached garage. It's wheelchair accessible. I think there's some, they can check off some boxes. So if somebody's looking for housing, but it's not easy. It's not. So I think a lot of families, what they end up doing is if they see a listing, they just visually have to go and see it themselves. And sometimes people will say it's wheelchair accessible, but it's really not.
Right.
It's, I mean, like a wheelchair accessible bathroom has to be like a roll in shower, not a wide door. There's
Right.
always like, what is wheelchair accessible when you're saying wheelchair accessible? Even we see that in hotels, it's a wheelchair accessible room. And then you get there, there's a tub in there with no bench, no
Right.
transfer bench. So I think it's like, what is wheelchair accessible, and how do we define that? So I think oftentimes most families just have to kind of visually go and see it to make sure that their wheelchair fits in there.
Yeah, I mean, you've just highlighted all from the other side, all the things that the families have to go through for a child who's got a physical disability, right? The things that they have to go through and things that it just adds to the challenge.
Yeah, right? Like another big one that I see that I wish I had like really time to put on a fight is that there's changing tables, right, for like the family's children. But that 2-year-old is going to turn into a 14-year-old who sometimes still needs help with like toileting, and they wear like incontinence products. So the moms are like, where am I supposed to change my 13-year-old boy? Like I can't not put him in that transfer, like in that changing table. Where do I put them? And until I started working at the wheelchair clinic, I was like, oh my God, you're right.
Yeah.
So when we're having these conversations, a lot of the times they want recline on their chair. And I tell them like, well, that's going to add a lot of weight. Are you sure you really want that feature? They're like, that's the only place I can change my child when I go to the bathroom, because
Makes
there's
sense.
nowhere I can lay him down, right? Some places are starting to do the kind of the drop down mat tables to accommodate individuals of all heights and weights in a public
Mhm.
bathroom, which I think it's great. And it's also not just for children. I mean, there's individuals with like spinal cord injuries, or other individuals with disabilities who go to the bathroom and they need to lay down,
Right.
catheters or other things. So a lot of these families are like, I go to a public bathroom that's wheelchair accessible, but there's nowhere for me to lay my family member to change them. Um, so that's kind of a huge thing, and I think it's entering the conversation as of recently. So it's a fight that has to be put, and I never thought of that until I talked to
Yeah.
the families when they tell me like, well, this is what my wheelchair needs, and I start asking questions like, why do you want that feature? And I was like, okay, it makes sense why you want to use your wheelchair go to the bathroom for toileting.
That's a great insight. And can I ask you, like, how long does it take with the for them to get wheelchairs or ramps, especially with, we know with COVID or during the pandemic, there's been a delay with everything, really.
There is supply issues. Okay, so it's a very upsetting period right now with COVID and equipment and everything. Typically, to get a wheelchair, it's a very lengthy process. Insurances want doctors, so there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes that insurance wants. So the insurance wants medical records, and they want a progress note from a physician stating the need for the wheelchair. So we get that first, and then we schedule the wheelchair appointment. We do the assessment, and it's a very collaborative assessment. Everybody in the team is an equal member. And I tell families, everybody here is an expert. You are the expert in your child's lived experience as a mom, as a caregiver, as a father, a sibling, whoever you are. You're the lived experience expert. I bring in the knowledge of the clinical setting, posture, function, and then the supplier who works for a company, they bring the knowledge of the equipment. So then I write my letter, send it to the physician, they signed it, and then we send it to the supplier. And then the supplier initiates the order. Insurance typically have 45 days to review it. And once it gets approved and they get that approval letter, the supplier can start purchasing all the different components. And the wheelchair has different components, and it can come from different manufacturers. Like a cushion may come from one manufacturer, the backrest from another, the headrest from another. So then they start ordering all the different parts, putting it together, and then it's ready to be fitted and delivered. Now here, we always tell the families, you have to come back to the clinic and a therapist has to see you, because one, we can verify that everything we recommended is accurately being delivered, because the families don't know that this cushion is named the Matrix, whatever. They don't understand. They just pick the cushion. So then I compare notes, what we talked about, and we make sure that everything's nice and supported and aligned and that the individual is comfortable. But oftentimes, like, there's supply chain issues right now. There's a lot of back order. Like if one part is on back order, the whole chair cannot be delivered because the family has to sign off that it was delivered completely. So that can add to the delays. Sometimes physicians don't sign the paperwork and it sits on their desk for a month, and we keep faxing and requesting and it doesn't arrive. So that adds maybe another month. Getting paperwork faxed and sent. So typically if everything falls in place nicely and perfect, it should be 3 to 4 months. But right now with COVID, and also people call off because of COVID, so that delays things a little bit more. It's 6, 8, 9 months.
Goodness gracious.
And then what happens is that everything's time-stamped. So the insurance will say, that letter of medical necessity is now too old. So now we have to start over. And it's really heartbreaking to tell that information to the families. Like, I'm sorry, like, I know I saw you back in April, everything got delayed. Now the insurance is saying that everything's expired, so we have to start over. And it's very frustrating for the families. And I mean, I have no good way to say this to them and break down the news, because they've been waiting 9 months for their equipment, and the child needs the equipment. The individual needs to be comfortable. So it's very frustrating for the families. It's very frustrating for everybody right now. And there are families who just kind of like call and they try to do everything in their power to speed things up. And I also try to do everything to speed things up. And I can only do so much. But it's very frustrating right now. Everything is just delayed.
You talk about the supply, because of the supply chain, I think I can see how especially when you talk about the different components coming from different places, that adds to the complexity of just fitting this right wheelchair for this child. Well, not only that, but in 10 months, the child grows.
Right? Yes, then exactly. Then we have to retake those measurements, because those measurements are not like 9 months old. And then another thing kind of to really emphasize is that, especially around this time of the year, towards the end of the year, families have met their out-of-pocket expenses and their deductibles, so everything is met. So they come in, they see me like in November or early December, and they're thinking, okay, the insurance is going to cover everything. I'm not going to owe anything out of pocket. It's great. And then I have to break the news and tell them nothing gets billed to the insurance until the day they hand you the chair, which can be in 6 months from now or next year. And they get really upset because they're thinking it's all happening right now. They're like, well, we're seeing you right now. And I'm like, yes, but you're not getting the equipment today. So even though you've met your out of pocket, your deductible, it's going to roll now over into the next year. So then they sometimes don't have that information, and it can be upsetting because they have to budget. I mean, these are very expensive equipment when we're talking a wheelchair or a power wheelchair that can be many, many thousands of dollars. And they have a 20% like copay or whatever their insurance is. It can be expensive. So they plan accordingly, and they're thinking it's happening at the end of the year, but that's going to roll over till the early next year, and they're probably going to have to pay for that.
So what happens here, because they've come to do the assessment, the wheelchair assessment, right? Say they come in January to see you, they come to do the wheelchair assessment, they are waiting. So they've done their part, you have done your part, now we're waiting. But because of the backlog and the delay with the supply chain, so you get it, say, in October, right? Or maybe November or December, right? And so now that's the cutoff, right? Because things have changed, or now the timestamp, like you talked about. So what happens there? Do they have to, when they redo the assessment, they have to pay for that too, correct?
They have to pay, yes. So a lot of the times, individuals who have complex needs, depending on their insurance, they have, sometimes they're called patient advocates or care coordinators. There's different titles depending on your insurance. I always tell the families, call your insurance, see if you have a patient advocate, a care coordinator, a care manager. It's different titles. And that individual is appointed to you in your child, your case. And sometimes they can help move things along quicker, and they can advocate for the family. Because you're right, it's not the family's fault that there were supply chain issues, that somebody got COVID. They're just doing everything on their part. And I'm trying to do the best I can on my end. And I told them, call the insurance. You have advocates. See what can be done, because you're right. You shouldn't have to come back and now maybe pay more or pay for an extra visit. If you still haven't, if you pay out of pocket. So those are all like policy issues that also another stressor to the families, having to deal with all this insurance issues. And I try to do the best I can to educate families and provide them with resources to kind of prepare them to. And once they get the second and third wheelchair, I think they start getting a sense of what happens. It's usually that very first wheelchair that's very overwhelming because they don't understand this process. But it's just a lot of educating and providing resources to the families. And that's why it's kind of good for families to connect, because they can educate each other. And they do sometimes, and oftentimes, like, I think the social media space has allowed families to connect when they can't connect with somebody in their communities. That's one option. But there's a lot of educating and advocating and fighting for the families. I mean, I have to write so many appeal letters, Kavitha. I spend so many hours appealing for equipment that I know my families need, like a backrest. Some insurances will deny the backrest. So then I have to say, like, to the insurance, you want them to just sit without a backrest? I mean, you're in an office chair with a backrest. Right? Like, as you're reading my letter, don't you think that somebody has the right also to sit comfortably throughout the day in a wheelchair with a comfortable backrest? So it's so many, they just don't want to pay. And I have to do a lot of appealing, which also kind of adds to the process. But usually when that happens, like, I'll keep the families informed. Your equipment got denied, or this component got denied. I'm appealing it. So it may take a little bit longer, but I'm working on your behalf so you can get the equipment that you deserve.
Oh, I'm so glad that they have you, all the therapists that are working, especially with equipments right now, because they wouldn't know, what they would need, or a harness, or, like you said, what kind of back, what kind of even seating material, which is different for each child.
It's like, I mean, think how overwhelming it is to purchase a car when you can pick all the different features. it's a very similar process. Like families are like, what, I don't know what models are out there, what manufacturers, what features, what cushions. There's so many options of equipment, and we have to match that equipment to the needs of the individual. So we have to really kind of closely assess the individual to see what they need and their positioning and functioning needs, to get them the best equipment for them and for the whole family as a whole too.
Right. And what kind of wheelchairs are there? Could you describe?
So there's so many. So I think the whole process, we start, okay, do you want dependent mobility? So that means that the individual is not going to be able to move by themselves individually, like by themselves, either because they don't have arm function or maybe cognitive delay. So that means that a caregiver will always have to push them. So that's dependent mobility. And then there's independent mobility, like what we think of a traditional wheelchair with hand rims that individual can move. And then there's power chairs for individuals who have the cognitive ability, but maybe don't have the arm strength to move. So they go into a power wheelchair. And then within those categories, so then we kind of narrow the categories. And then we kind of start asking questions like, what does your home look like? What does your vehicle look like? What are the goals of the individual? So there's this whole like lengthy process of conversations that kind of helps us narrow down the chair. And then we go into cushions and then tires and then push handles, chest straps, bells. Like there's so many different components that we can select. And at Shirley Ryan, I think we're very fortunate that we have a room of demos to show to the family, so
That's nice.
they can lift it and they can see how heavy it is. And we have a closet of cushions, so we bring out different cushions so for them to trial. Sometimes there's significant asymmetries, like pretty significant scoliosis, so we have to do maybe a custom mold, which is very custom to the individual's body. There's so many options for wheelchairs. It can be overwhelming. It truly can be. Sometimes that's why we do multiple appointments sometimes, so the families can go home and process and maybe do a little bit of their own research, because it's a commitment, because once they get sat on the chair, they can't come back next year like, well, now I kind of really want that chair because I think that's better now. Because
Right.
the insurance is going to be, why do you want a chair if you already have one that's safe that you chose a year ago?
Do they get to do a trial, or is it just in the clinic itself that they get to
So
try?
I mean, they trial it in the clinic, and then case by case, if available, the supplier will sometimes drop it off in their home and they can use it for a week if it's
Okay.
available. But it's very case by case. So if they really, I mean, because sometimes will they fit in their home? That's another question, right? So sometimes I'll tell the suppliers, is there any way you can give them a little loaner for a week so they can, because
Yeah.
that's truly how somebody gets to really feel how a chair works, and the caregivers can lift it and the individual
Right.
can sit comfortably. I mean, I mean, 1 hour is not really going to answer that question. So in a perfect scenario, like sometimes they'll do it, but I mean, sometimes the equipment is not available, so they cannot. And then these are conversations like, what happens if they take the equipment and they don't like it, right? And
Right.
it
N-
didn't work how they thought it was going to work.
And for people who have never tried like an activity chair or a wheelchair, there's so many different parts to it.
Yes. So, I mean, or sometimes it's a good part for somebody, and then I trial it with somebody else and it's not a good part for them, right? It depends how their body moves. If they have a lot of tone, and for example, they really bring their arms in, they can rub on the hardware. So maybe they need a different type of hardware. Maybe they tend to push back against the backrest. So maybe we need like a hardware that's a little bit more durable. So it's very individualized. That's why it's complex. It's considered like complex equipment versus like an off the shelf, out of the box, like you go to CVS and you get a wheelchair, because that's
Right.
one size fits all. This is very individualized to the individual. Their measurements, we take their measurements, we look at their posture, we look at their movement patterns, weakness, everything, and try to match the equipment to their needs.
I'm just thinking also with family members, caregivers, or they have somebody else step in to help them when they are at work. There's just so many different components to know how to get this chair to tilt, how to move things around,
Yeah.
you know.
And there's different options for tilt. Like if you're talking a tilt in space wheelchair, do you want it to tilt with the hands? Do you want to use your foot to tilt? And then families are like, I didn't know I had an option. I was like, well, let's go through those options. Or they want a very specific tire. And I'm like, well, that tire is a little, there's pros and cons to the different tires. There's like air tires, there's solid tires. One is lighter, one is heavier, one needs more maintenance, one doesn't. And they're like, I had no idea. They're like, it's like shopping for a car.
Right. Yeah.
And
And
I think a good experience for the families is when they are provided with these options.
mhm,
Nobody should go to the family and tell them like, this is the wheelchair that's perfect for your child, right? They are supposed to be provided with options. That's how ideally it should work. And there should always be a therapist present or a physician um, available like in the session. And they ask questions and they provide them with options like, let's try these different cushions, let's try these different backrests, because they cannot just sell one piece of equipment and deliver like, this is for you, perfect.
when you talked about the mold, for somebody who has for the back, do you do the molding in the back for the backrest for these individuals for
Yeah.
scoliosis?
So it's for little kiddos who have cerebral palsy, especially the ones that are very like hypotonic, they're very low tone. I want to preserve their alignment as much as possible, right? And you want to preserve it until they're going to reach skeletal maturity. So for like around 18, 20, I don't know, it varies depending on the individual. Once they stop growing, then there's other options, right? But you want to maintain that skeletal maturity as much as you can. So oftentimes it's with a custom mold. So we do it, it's very interesting, the process. So we sit them in this molding chair. It's kind of a bean bag. So there's little beads inside. We shape it around their bodies and then we take the air out and then it leaves this kind of mold of their bodies. So I position them nice and aligned and it's like a mold. And then from that mold, the supplier with their iPad, they scan the image. So they have like this 3D rotational image that they send off to the manufacturer. And from that image, they fabricate a custom molded seating. It's one of a kind. No one else can sit in it because no one else has that body. And it fits for that individual. And it's designed, one, to give the most support to kind of really limit the scoliosis or the progression of the scoliosis. And then two, to really prevent wounds, because you want like good pressure distribution, you want nice and support. So if somebody has like wounds, so it's for skin protection, alignment, comfort, and like sitting tolerance.
You bring up another important point about sores and wounds and pressure points. Do they have to be repositioned in the wheelchair, or does that help?
So if the individual is not able to shift their weight because motor control, motor impairment, maybe some cognitive delays, weakness, then they probably either need a dependent tilt and space wheelchair or a power wheelchair. And typically the medical research tells us that pressure relief is supposed to occur every 2 hours for at least 2 minutes. I mean, if we look at ourselves, Kavitha, we've been kind of shifting our weight throughout this conversation. I mean, think about if you had to just sit statically in that position for more than 2 hours, then there's no blood flow in your bottom, right? Like, I mean, all the capillaries, everything gets compressed and there's no oxygenation, and that's how you start developing the wounds. But if I tilt you back, you allow blood flow in there, so you prevent the wounds. And there's also other things to consider, like the clothing that the individual wears. Jeans are very hard. Jeans are cute, they're adorable, but they tend to be very hard. And sometimes they put pressure on the skin versus something softer or cotton. And where does the individual spend other time? Like, I mean, bed, are you kind of like rotating them, rolling them side to side? How much do they spend on a couch? A couch can be comfortable, but that material doesn't breathe very well. So cushions in a wheelchair are also designed to breathe. They have a very, the covers, I mean, there's a lot of science behind the cushion and the cover to prevent wounds. If you sit just on a recliner all day, that's just like heavy, thick, warm foam. So it kind of also tends to kind of either worsen the wound or start creating wounds.
No, as we keep talking, you keep bringing up more and more things for people to think about, which is great because
so
it's
many,
like,
yeah, so many things. This is a lot of educating, like how often do you do a pressure relief? Like, does the school do the pressure relief? Is somebody teaching the school staff to do pressure reliefs?
right.
Are they changing their position? Are they going in a stander, in a mat, in the floor to play? I mean, you want to change the position as often as possible.
And you talk about the school system. Do they possibly have a one-on-one aid to help them in the school settings?
I mean, we would hope so. I know like every district is different and the funding is different, but if somebody cannot change their position, the school needs to provide, I mean, co-supervision, making sure that their position is being changed throughout the day, that they're positioned comfortably and safely in their wheelchair, that the individual is moved around so they can participate in all the activities with their little friends. You know, you don't want them kind of sitting in a corner. You want to make sure that they're kind of rolled into like with their friends and participating in like circle time and all these other activities. Some schools have a 1-to-1. I think some schools have a 2-to-1.
But there
Yeah.
is someone. I'm thinking
There's always like,
have to be.
yeah, there's always there's a teacher and there's like at least like multiple like assistants kind of helping with the children and the teenagers or whatever their age is, kind of helping them navigate the environment.
You know, you also talked about different kinds of clothing. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that because the jeans, you're right, people think it's really cute and that's
We're really
fancy.
cute. I learned so much from my families. My families are some of my biggest teachers. And every time they come into the clinic, I'm like, where did you get that? Like nowadays there's like onesies with like a little hole for like the G-tube button. There's special clothing for codes. So the caregiver can just put the clothing facing forward instead of through the back because it's just easier when they're in a wheelchair. They show me like different sorts of like ponchos that they can just put over their head and they're kind of warm in their wheelchair. They show me different kinds of like shoes that can accommodate the AFOs. A lot of it, Etsy is a good place to find adaptive clothing. And you know, we're starting to see more adaptive clothing like at Target, other retailers, which is really nice to see. And they're cute, and I mean they just like normal clothing. There's different for pants, especially for like individuals with spinal cord injury that have like zippers on the side. I mean, Kavitha, we're OTs. Like this was like I think we learned in school, right? How to adapt clothing.
Right.
So putting on, because it's, I mean, as the individual gets taller and heavier, like managing clothing is trickier. So finding adaptable clothing, and if you search like adaptive clothing, you find so many different websites that either moms started this because they found a need based on their lived experience, or they heard it through another mom or another caregiver. So it's coming along. I mean, there's still definitely like room for improvement. So if anybody has any ideas or wants to create something, because it's the caregivers that are managing this, the struggles, like what can be easier? Like, I don't want to do this clothing to reach the G-tube side. Hey, how about we just make a little hole in there? Right. They create their own things and they sell it on Etsy or other websites.
That's actually good to know that they have it on Etsy. I know about Target because I was really excited when they came up with their line for, for children, individuals with disabilities, especially for kids, and cute clothing, like you said. Yeah. You talked about the moms and moms creating those because it's, like you said, is a lived experience. They're there with them knowing what really works, what's the challenge, and what can we do easiest, because kids, you have to change them, like toileting. I mean, you've got a diaper change, you got to make, because you're constantly changing them, right?
Yeah, and they even sometimes create little things for the wheelchairs that are not available in the market. Like sometimes moms will ask me like, "Oh, I mean, he hits his arms against the armrest. Like, is there anything?" And we'll search. Me and the supplier, we do the best we can. We're like, we see nothing in the market because if it's not medically coded, the insurance doesn't want to pay for it.
Right.
So sometimes like families come into the clinic and I'm like, what did you do there? Show me, talk to me. And they create so many amazing things just based on their frustrations. Like, well, I mean, he kept getting so many bruises from hitting here. So I padded this up. I put a cover and I slid it here. And I was like, oh my God, that, and I'll take pictures and I'll share it with other caregivers, or everybody wants to know what's the best cup holder, right? Or how do they, any hooks to carry like medical supply bags, and also like Bye Bye Baby's a good resource. Like things that are for strollers can be used in wheelchairs. They can just easily be interchanged. The
What?
tubing is the same, so they can, if there's like a specific cup holder, either for the child or for their coffee, mom's coffee, if you can get like the clamp is the same. So Bye Bye Baby, the Target, the baby section. If there's stuff for strollers, they can be used for the wheelchair.
That's actually great what you just talked about, because not just the kids drink, but the caregiver who might be pushing the child around,
Right.
they need both hands,
Let's
you
think
know.
about the moms and their coffees, right? And they want to like their purse and all this other stuff that they need to carry and manage. Um, I also learned about like if they have if the mom has a child with a disability and they're using a wheelchair, and then they have a toddler, they can attach the little kind of scooter board so the child can sit in the back and hold on, just like they do in the strollers.
Yeah.
They can change the tubing and put it in the wheelchair. Um, that way their other child can just kind of stand and be pushed along while the mom
That is
pushes.
so cool.
Yeah, similar to like the strollers.
Right. No, but that's a really cool idea.
Right.
That
I
every
learned, I'm telling you, like my moms are my best teachers. I learned so much because they're the ones doing this every day, right? They're the ones out in the community, in the stores, at family events, and I come back and like show me, and I would like tell me what you did, and I know what moms come up with things, and they're excited to show me. They're great teachers.
Well, if you want to share, like, as a resource for people listening to the podcast, you can, at the end, we can put like a list of different things that where they can go and source out for things. Even your moms, if they are, creating things, that would be awesome. Yeah. I was just thinking, because that is amazing to have, because otherwise you're holding a child, you have your cup of coffee. I know I need my cup of coffee in the morning, you know.
I mean, they have it for the like a commercial stroller. They have a little area for like their cup. So I think it's all, in all fairness, if you have a child in a wheelchair, then you should be able to kind of put your coffee, your latte, your espresso,
Yeah.
a hook for your bag. Um, it's limited space, and because there's no undercarriage in a
Mhm.
unless it's like a stroller, a medical stroller. But a wheelchair doesn't have room for like undercarriage to store like a diaper bag or like medical supplies bag. So oftentimes we have to get like carabiner hooks
Mhm.
attached to the push handles, and that's how they can hang a medical bag or like a book bag with medical supplies.
And is that covered by insurance, or is that out of pocket for the parents?
So it is out of pocket. It's
Yeah.
so unfortunate that a lot of these things that can be life changing for families are considered convenience items. So they don't want to pay. They don't want to pay for a lot of things, unfortunately. There's a lot, everything is meticulously coded and priced. Um, so things that are like a little cup holder for the child, no, that's convenience, or hooks to carry medical device, convenience. Um, so unless it's like very medically necessary, they typically don't want to pay for it.
That's what you're talking about, the added costs that families have to consider.
Right, like for example, like a medical stroller. Some kids, some of the strollers have canopies, for the sun. I
Mhm.
mean, some kids have sensitivity to light, or just like, protection from the sun. And some insurances don't want to pay for it. They just consider that convenience. Even though like I'll make a medical justification for it to get it covered and funded, some insurances do not want to pay for it.
I mean, I don't want to be in the sun all the time. Medically I'm fine, but yeah, it's just,
No, that's, I mean, it's, I consider like, it's not a medical, it's not a convenience. I feel like it's a necessity.
yeah. Um, do you have any kids who you have seen who maybe have a combination of maybe not just the physical, issues that they're going through, but also maybe sensory issues that they are going through or having or displaying?
Yeah, like we do have like some dual diagnosis. Like, we actually recently there was a little girl who had hemiplegia, cerebral palsy, and she had autism. So I mean, you get that sensory component, and then the motor impairments, difficulty with like social interaction. So kind of how do we navigate that? Because sometimes like things in the chair don't feel comfortable for her, or she doesn't like certain textures, or she has difficulty like kind of doesn't want to stay seated all the time. So how do we manage all those things, and how do we best support her to keep her safe?
Is that well, you have a comorbidity like that because she has a diagnosis, right? So you definitely take a look at that. Do kids who can verbalize tell you stuff as well, like this is not so comfortable, or
They do. The older kids do, the teenagers, and they're so insightful. And anytime, like the little kids, they don't. I mean, they're still kind of working on their language development, or they don't have their communication device. But we do see like a lot of teenagers, and I mean, they're so insightful. And I mean, and people with cerebral palsy live in a lot of pain. They do. They live in a lot of pain, especially if you have spasms and their body spasms, and it pulls and it turns and it rotates. It can be very painful. So I asked them, like, is there anything I can do to alleviate that pain? And oftentimes it's more than just it's beyond the wheelchair. It's what their body's doing. But there are things that I can maybe do to improve their comfort. Like I'll recline the back a little bit. And it's very nice because they can tell me like, does this help you? Does it make it worse? But it's very challenging when they can't tell me that, and I have to rely a lot on facial expressions. Or moms know, they know. Like if I ask them, like, do you think he's uncomfortable? Oh yes, he's in a lot of pain, or he's not comfortable, or oh no, he's okay, he's comfortable. They just know their facial expressions very, very well. So we start moving things around the chair to see if we can provide as much relief as we can.
no, that's awesome. And I was just thinking, as you were talking, it's like in your own car seat in the car, we constantly move it around just to make it as comfortable.
Oh, Kavitha,
Yeah.
I back pain all the time. I have to use my little lumbar support. Right. And we can do that. We can shift ourselves. We can kind of figure out like what works, what doesn't. And with our patient and clients, I recognize the level of expertise that moms bring. And I think sometimes they find that frustrating that they speak with caregivers and caregivers don't listen. I listen intently. Like I respect them as caregivers. So I get a lot of their feedback, and I get them really involved in the sessions. Like, do you think if I maybe raise this leg rest up a little bit, do you think that'll be comfortable for him? It'll cause him pain. And they give very good feedback. And I think if they are recognized for their level of expertise, they get more engaged in the process, and then we just build a better relationship. A lot of the parents just want that recognition that they honestly deserve, truly.
Yeah, no, I think it's very powerful what you said, because they know their kids best.
They are with them 24 hours a day. Nobody knows that child more than their caregivers, right? I mean, I'm not an expert. I know certain things about the body, and I can definitely like help out. But without the insight of the caregivers, I mean, I'm very limited with what I can do. And I always remind that to the suppliers, because their training is very different. And they have a very engineering mind. And I always tell them, like, don't forget the social and emotional component that goes into this whole process. I mean, you want things to be 90 degrees and mom wants it over here, and I'm going to support mom.
Right. Because they would know, like, you might think it's 90 degrees, but really he might need a 20-degree tilt that makes him more comfortable. That's how he is at home. Yeah, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. It's been so insightful, this whole journey.
Yes, this whole, I just really I truly love being an occupational therapist. I love working in the communities. I love working in wheelchairs. I love building relationships with the families. And we can talk on for hours and hours, Kavitha.
I love that. One last question.
Right.
In playgrounds, is that accessible for them, like the normal playgrounds, with them being wheelchair bound?
We're seeing improvements. We are seeing some improvements, but of course, there's always room for more. And I've noticed a lot of these initiatives are usually led by moms who go to the playground and they see how excluded their child is. So they start like initiatives. They start talking to their aldermen or representatives in their communities, like, how do I make a wheelchair, a playground accessible? And they start networking and getting funding, and they'll make it. Well, actually, one of my families did that. The mom,
Yeah, that's
she got
awesome.
in her suburb, she got a fully wheelchair accessible playground for her
That's
daughter.
wonderful.
Yeah, so it's happening in certain neighborhoods and in certain communities, but definitely there's room for more. And all playgrounds, when they're designed, should be fully universally accessible for all children, right?
I hope that's the direction it's going in. And, you mentioning that for parents to advocate for themselves because they know their kids so well, go up to your local leaders, and try to make that change. Because, if you don't ask, they don't know.
Right.
Right.
And I think my dream is to eventually, like, this just kind of becomes like second nature. Like when they design the playground, they're just gonna do it. And the families do a great job advocating, but the goal is like, it's just gonna be designed that way from now on. So I'm hoping that's the direction we eventually go. Every time I see a new playground, I'm like, is that accessible? Is there a ramp in there?
You know what? I hope though, that when they are designing the universal design for a wheelchair accessible playground, that they also touch base with an occupational therapist, because put them on the team, because that's what we're trained to do.
Right, and because we can make that playground very accessible to children with autism, to children with cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, all sorts of children, right? Make it truly universally accessible, so all children, regarding their abilities, can just play there and engage and like socially interact with other peers. Like that's just part of every child, and that they should have that opportunity.
And that's a huge part of growth, play,
Play.
Yeah,
that's the main occupation of a child, play.
right. Exactly. Oh my God, this has been just a fabulous conversation with you. I want to thank you so much for taking the time and educating us on the complexities of ADA and universal designs, basically the home, the wheelchairs. You brought up this excellent point about parents being the huge advocates as well, including them in our teams as well. Thank you. Is there any parting words that you have for us?
I think I just really want to give recognition to the mothers, right? Like I think they deserve to be recognized as experts. Moms need to know that they own value in any team decision. I think also like healthcare is kind of moving to this like partnering decision making. They are my greatest teachers, and I love what I do, and I'm here to support them in any way I can. And I love that. This is why I love being an occupational therapist. I just truly love it.
Right. And we do use the family-centered approach, right? How we,
yeah. Glad. Yes.
Parents, or sometimes the siblings come in too, because they're playing with them and they'll tell you things, so.
Recognize the siblings, all the family members, all the grandmas out there, fathers, aunts, uncles, the whole team, everybody.
Grandmothers will bring in new techniques you've never heard of, and you're like,
right.
Oh, is that what you used before? And they're like, yeah.
Well, love working with the grandmothers.
Well, thank you once again. I so appreciate this time with you, and for you sharing and imparting this knowledge for the rest of folks who are going to be listening in.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.